Magnus the Red has kept a private chronicle of his own life since 832 M30. He writes it in his own hand, in Tizcan script, on parchment of his own making. The chronicle survives, fragments of it, in the Thousand Sons archives, recovered by Inquisitor Khyrosos in 011.M42. The chronicle is, by Primarch standards, meticulously complete. There is one gap. From 927 M30 to 964 M30, 37 standard years. Magnus does not record where he was, what he did, or whom he spoke to. The pages exist. They are blank. They are blank because Magnus himself burned the entries in a single afternoon in 965.M30 and could not afterwards remember why. The Book of Magnus is canonical. The Lexicanum records it. The Black Library Aeldari hold a copy of it that screams. The original rests on Sortiarius, in the innermost chamber of the Tower of the Cyclops, and Magnus carries it when he goes to war.
Towards the end of the Great Crusade, the Primarch of the Thousand Sons sat down and dictated, to a single human scribe, every piece of sorcerous knowledge he had ever gathered. The scribe was a remembrancer named Mahavastu Callimachus. The fandom records phrase the role plainly. Callimachus recorded the Crimson King's every thought and deed. Years later, on a different world, after he had fled Prospero ahead of Nicaean censure, Callimachus would realize that much of what he had been transcribing was not memoir at all. It was ritual. The book his master had dictated was a series of mystic rites, dressed in the form of a journal. The line between Magnus's history and Magnus's sorcery was, in Callimachus's hands, a line that did not exist. We do not, in primary canon, have a separate personal chronicle dated from 832 M30.
What we have is the testimony of the man who wrote down what Magnus told him, and the tradition the Thousand Sons preserved for 10,000 years that treats Magnus's words as the foundation of every sorcerous discipline they practice. The channel's archive treats the chronicle and the book as the same artifact, with the same blanks where the book's compilation work could have included the Crusade's middle decades and chose not to. The blanks are real. What fills them is the question this video is going to walk into. Magnus was discovered on Prospero in 840.M30. The Lexicanum entry on Magnus is explicit on the date. The emperor's fleet arrived at Tizcan, the city of light. Magnus and the emperor embraced and conversed as if the two had known each other for many standard years. For solar decades after, they traveled and studied the immaterium together. The emperor imparted further knowledge to his gene son and issued multiple warnings about the dangers inherent in overindulging the gifts of the psyker. Some canon sources note a slippage. The Thousand Sons may not have been fighting in the Crusade until 900 M30. The official record states 840. The Crusade chronologies say later. The brief from this channel takes the longer view. Magnus was a Primarch from the moment he was found. The decades between his discovery and his legion's first recorded campaign are the decades in which his father taught him things the imperial truth would later forbid. The City of Light was built around 8 temple arcologies, then 9. The 9th was the Pyramid of Photep, built of gold and silver, the personal sanctum of Magnus the Red. Few other than the most trusted of the Thousand Sons officer corps and the elite warriors of the First Fellowship ever entered those halls. Inside that pyramid, the original of the Book of Magnus was assembled.
The cults of the Thousand Sons. The 5 sorcerous orders the Lexicanum names as the Athenians, the Corvidae, the Pavoni, the Pyrae, and the Raptora, each specialized in a discipline of the warp.
The Athenians were telepaths. The Lexicanum is explicit. They were practiced masters of the discipline of telepathy and could transmit their thoughts and read the thoughts of others. They served as the legion's communications officers because their communications were secure from all but other psychers. They worked with the Corvidae on intelligence operations gleaned psychically. None of the canonical sources name memory editing as a cult discipline. That is a separate practice. Hold that. We will come back to it. What the canon does record in the Council of Nicaea entry is the year 001 M31. The emperor convened a council on the world of Nicaea to settle, once and for all, the question of psychers. Magnus was the primary proponent of the warp powers.
He called on the emperor not to ban the use of psychic abilities, but to contribute to further research into their usage. Mortarion accused his brother of using the forbidden arts of sorcery. The emperor heard the testimony and ruled. Sorcery, the practice of bargaining for power or knowledge with the intelligent entities that existed within the warp, was banned. Magnus paid no heed to this edict. He continued his investigations in secret. The 37 years this video is about ended 36 years before Magnus's father made the law that would have made what he did inside them a capital crime. The window is pre-Nicaean. It belongs to the period of the Crusade in which Magnus could still believe, accurately, that what his father was asking of him was sanctioned. What does the gap actually look like? Here is what the channel's archive marks. Between 927.M30 and 964.M30, the Thousand Sons' contemporaneous record of where Magnus was, what world he was on, which compliance he was prosecuting, becomes thin. The Black Library has not novelized that stretch densely. The fan-curated Crusade timelines, Battle Bunnies, Time L, the various compendia of dated heresy-era events, treat the late 800s and 900s of the 30th millennium as one of the documentary thin patches. The Wargamer guides do not fill it. Forge World Imperial Armor does not fill it. The Lexicanum's Magnus entry skips through it on the way to Nicaea. That is the absence the channel is naming. There is a window in which Magnus's whereabouts are unaccounted for in the open imperial record. The channel has anchored it to 927 to 964.M30 because that is the window the channel's prior video on Subject 11 named, and the audience read the naming and accepted it. The dating is not Black Library canon. The dating is the channel's archive marking the channel's own work.
Honor that as we go. But the records say otherwise inside the Thousand Sons' own institution. The Lost Primarch's entry on the fandom is explicit about what imperial records survive concerning the 2nd and 11th legions. There is a rare record accidentally placed into copies of the Astra Militarum's Imperial Infantrymen's Uplifting Primer in the 41st millennium. That leak, and it is the only leak, revealed that the long-lost 2nd and 11th legions of the ancient Space Marines participated in the campaigns of the Rangdan Genocides during the Great Crusade. The Rangdan Genocides took place in the 860s of the 30th millennium, with what was most likely the final Rangdan Genocide in the 890s. The fandom records this carefully. The 11th Primarch had not been rediscovered yet during the Genocides. He was unable to personally lead his legion. His legion was deployed, and renowned warriors of the 11th fought in the 890s. The Primarch himself, wherever he was being raised, had not yet come home.
If the 11th was not in the field by 890.M30, but his legion was, then the question becomes when the Primarch was located. Canon does not answer. The Lexicanum's 2 unknown legions entry treats his location as one of the deliberate silences of the setting.
The Edict of Obliteration page goes further. It records that the complete and utter erasure of all records of the 2nd and 11th legions is considered by imperial historians as the most successful edict of obliteration ever carried out in imperial history. The exact phrasing, and this is canon, is that the records of these two Primarchs and the 2nd and 11th legions were so effectively purged that over 10 Terran millennia later, their transgressions against the Imperium of Man are still known only to the surviving Primarchs and the God Emperor himself. Read that line carefully. The surviving Primarchs know. The Emperor knows.
A canonical text in 41st millennium imperial archival voice names the surviving Primarchs as the keepers of the secret. Magnus, before his fall, was a surviving Primarch. Magnus, on the planet of the sorcerers, is a surviving Primarch still. The Edict of Obliteration article is telling us in canon language that he is one of the men in the galaxy who knows. Ask yourself what knowing looks like for a Primarch with the warpcraft Magnus has. Here is what Magnus's documented sorcerous tradition contains. The cults are 5: telepathy, precognition, physiokinesis, pyrokinesis, telekinesis. The Athenians are explicit. Their job is reading and transmitting thought. They are not, in canonical wiki text, named as memory editors. But the Imperium has a separate canonical practice for that. It is called mind cleansing. The Warhammer 40k fandom is precise about its mechanism. Mind cleansing, colloquially called a mind wipe, is a process often utilized by the Inquisition to remove things too dangerous to know, with the subject's memories selectively erased and thought patterns altered through a combination of psychoviral, electrochemical mimetic, and telepathic intervention. The Imperium can erase a man's memory selectively. The Imperium does it routinely. The Imperium's most powerful psyker, the one whose Athenian cult specialized in the exact telepathic discipline that mind cleansing requires as its final stage, is the one being asked by the canonical Edict of Obliteration text to keep the 11th secret for 10 millennia. There are two ways that secret stays kept. Either Magnus knows and chooses to be silent, or Magnus is made to forget. The brief from this channel argues the second.
The argument is not that Magnus's sorcerous tradition has a chapter titled Memory Editing. The argument is that the components of memory editing are present in the canonical practices, that Magnus has the highest psychic gift of any son, that the Imperium has a documented appetite for selective erasure as a tool of secrecy, and that no canon text exists that says Magnus chose silence. The silence we have is consistent with both. The brief takes the second reading because the second reading is the harder one, and because the audience reached it in the comments of the channel's prior video before the channel itself did. Wait, there is one more piece of canon that has to sit on the table before we can continue. Magnus possessed prophetic vision. The fandom records the moment Magnus peered into the warp and saw a vision of Horus's revolt and the roles all the legions would play, except his own. Read that carefully. His own role was missing from the vision.
Magnus's foresight, in the moment that mattered most, had a hole in it the shape of himself. The channel will not claim canon here, but the structural reading is available. A Primarch whose memory contains a self-edited absence is a Primarch whose foresight will, by the warp's symmetry, also contain that absence. The man does not see himself acting because the man cannot remember himself acting. The heresy began, in part, in the silence Magnus had already cut into his own past. 5 paragraphs back, we walked into the channel's window of 927 to 964 of the 30th millennium. We have established, in canon, that the 11th Legion was active in the late 800s and the 890s without its Primarch.
We have established in canon that the Edict of Obliteration was so successful that no imperial document records the moment the 11th was found, lost, or killed. We have established in canon that the Imperium has a routine practice of memory editing.
We have established in canon that Magnus had the gift and the disciplinary tradition that would make him the most natural psychic instrument for that practice. What we are now going to walk into is the brief's hypothesis. What happened inside that window? The hypothesis is not canon. The components are canon. The reader should hold the difference. The hypothesis. The 11th Primarch, having been located somewhere in or near the channel's window, was determined by the Emperor, for reasons the canon text leaves opaque, but which the Edict of Obliteration page calls transgressions known only to the surviving Primarchs and the Emperor, to be unfit to live. The Emperor, the canonical record establishes, was at this point in the Crusade conducting individual classified directives to individual Primarchs. James Swallow's The Buried Dagger documents the practice. Mortarion is sent ahead. Garrow is given quiet orders by Malcador. The Emperor and his sigillite functioned throughout the closing years of the Crusade by issuing instructions that were never recorded and never explained. The brief proposes that one of those instructions, given inside the channel's window, was given to Magnus. The instruction was to execute the brother who was to be erased. The brother to be erased was the 11th. The instrument was Magnus. The reason no canonical text records the act is that the canonical Edict of Obliteration explicitly does not record any acts pertaining to the 2nd and 11th legions. The reason no Black Library novel dramatizes the act is that the Black Library is forbidden from dramatizing what the edict erased. The reason Magnus himself does not record the act in his own meticulously kept chronicle is that the second half of the instruction, the part the brief argues was given alongside the first, was that the act, once done, was to be erased from the doer. Consider this. Magnus, who has stood for 10,000 years on the planet of the sorcerers, brilliant and ruined, with a copy of his own life dictated to a now-dead human scribe sitting in the tower of the Cyclops, has, in the brief's reading, lived inside an erasure that he himself executed and that he cannot afterward see. He went into the chamber. He took the warp craft of his own sorcerous tradition, categorically the Athenaean discipline of telepathy refined to its terminal selective application, or, equally consistently with canon, the standard imperial mind-cleansing procedure that the fandom describes as psychoviral, electrochemical mimetic, and telepathic, and he turned it against his own mind. Or, it was turned against him by a hand the Emperor had ordered to do it. The brief frames this as ambiguous and the channel will not resolve it. Both readings serve the same hypothesis.
The hypothesis is that Magnus, by 965.M30, had a clean stretch of pages in his chronicle, and a clean stretch of memory behind those pages, and no idea what he had done in the year before. But here is what is strange. Magnus's prophetic gift, his Corvidae tier precognition refined to the level only a Primarch could carry, never afterwards saw what he had done. The Corvidae developed their precognitive abilities. The Lexicanum is precise on the cult's brief. Magnus, as their first sorcerer king, had that gift in fullest measure. And yet, when he looked into the warp during the years of the heresy and tried to find his own future, the part of the future that touched his own past kept folding away from him. The vision of Horus's revolt that arrived to him in 005.M31 had every Primarch's role in it except his own. Read that as the brief reads it. The man whose memory has been cut
cannot see the cut.
The warp will not show him the absence inside his own head, because the warp shows the man what he is, and the man, by his own act, no longer contains that piece of what he was. This is where the hypothesis the brief proposes about the webway breach becomes structurally interesting. The canonical breach occurred in 004.M31. Magnus attempted to astrally project a warning to the Emperor about Horus because a warp storm was blocking astropathic messages and conventional communication was too slow. As his astral form blazed through the warp, he came across a webway corridor that led to Terra and decided to take a shortcut through it, unaware that this corridor was built by the Emperor as part of his top-secret webway project. Magnus tried in vain to breach the wall of the corridor. An anonymous voice from within the warp offered him the extra power he needed. The overconfident Magnus accepted. The psychic force required shattered the wards. The webway gate beneath the imperial palace ruptured. Demons flooded through. The war within the webway began. It would last 5 years. The Emperor would be permanently confined to the Golden Throne to contain the breach. The Webway Project, the project the Emperor had been building for centuries as humanity's escape route from the warp, was destroyed. Canon names the proximate cause as the Tzeentch voice and Magnus's acceptance of its power. That is not in dispute. What the brief proposes, and what the brief is careful to frame as scholarly hypothesis, not as canon, is the distal cause. Decades earlier, in the window the channel has marked, Magnus performed an act and then erased the memory of it. The act involved the warp's most precise form of self-editing. The erasure was clean enough that Magnus, for the rest of his recorded existence, would never afterward be able to find it. But the warp is not a clean medium. Memory is not, for a Primarch psyker, a passive store.
Memory is the substrate that grounds psychic stability. The brief argues that the erasure of an act that large, performed inside a mind that potent, did not stay erased structurally. It decayed. It leaked. By 004.M31, when an anonymous voice offered Magnus the extra power he needed to push through a webway wall, the wound at the base of Magnus's mind, the wound he had cut into himself nearly 40 years before, was open enough for the offer to be acceptable. He took the bargain because the foundation under the bargain was already gone. The official record states the bargain was Magnus's hubris. The brief is not asking the audience to disagree. The brief is asking the audience to look at what the hubris was sitting on. A man who has already let a part of himself be cut out, and who has lived 40 years not knowing it, is not a man who will catch a voice in the warp offering him more power than he should accept. He is a man who has, in the moment that matters, no internal alarm. The alarm was edited out with the act. Now picture this. Russ comes to Prospero in 004.M31. The wolves disembark on Tizcan. The pyramids burn. Magnus, in the Pyramid of Photep, refuses to fight until the last moment, then teleports the surviving 1,000 sons to the planet of the sorcerers in the Eye of Terror. Dan Abnett's Prospero Burns frames the wolves' perspective. They believed Magnus had been planting psychic agents inside other legions. They believed they were destroying a threat. Russ himself, in Abnett's hands, is a creature of severe duty performing the sanction his father had handed him. The wolves were not wrong about who they were sanctioning. They were wrong about which crime they were sanctioning. The Imperium told them they were burning a sorcerer who had broken the Edict of Nicaea and shattered the Emperor's wards. They were. They were also burning, in the same building, a man who had been used decades earlier to execute a brother and to forget executing him. That second crime was not Magnus's. The forgetting was. The killing was on order. The truth is, the channel's reframe of Magnus is structural. He is, in the brief's reading, both perpetrator and victim. He pulled the trigger. He was made to forget pulling it. The forgetting unmade him over 40 years. The unmaking opened the door to the bargain that broke the webway. The bargain that broke the webway gave Tzeentch the foothold that ultimately claimed Magnus's soul. The chain runs cleanly from the order in the channel's window to the demon prince standing in the Eye of Terror today, and at every link the chain is held by a hand other than Magnus's own. Ask yourself, who is responsible? The brief gives one answer: the Emperor. The buried dagger in the closing arc of the mainline Horus Heresy series document, and Imperial scholarship now treats as established, that the Emperor and Malcador ran the closing years of the Crusade by issuing classified directives to individual Primarchs.
Mortarian's pact with Typhon's contagion cult. Garrow's reassignment to Malcador's service. The Knights Errant program. These were not democratic decisions of the High Council. These were quiet instructions given individually, often in private, often without any other Primarch knowing. The buried dagger ends the mainline series with that fact in plain view. The Emperor knew how to give an order that would never be recorded. The Emperor knew how to give an order that was paid for, decades later, by the son who had carried it. The brief argues, and this is the harder claim, that one of those orders went to Magnus in the channel's window. The order was to execute the 11th. The order was to use his warpcraft, or to let it be used, to cut the memory of the act out of his own mind. The order was given because no living Primarch could be allowed to remember the 11th's name, and the Primarch with the gift to perform the cut on his own mind was Magnus, and the cut had to be performed on the doer because the doer would otherwise carry the name forever inside himself, and any of the others might one day find it. The order was sealed with the act. The Edict of Obliteration was the institutional codification of what Magnus had already done in his own head. The bureaucratic erasure was the public mirror of the private one. They were the same operation. The Emperor watched the consequence and never spoke. Through the heresy, the burning of Prospero, the war within the webway, the centuries on the planet of the sorcerers, the Emperor, confined to the golden throne by the very breach Magnus opened, has not, in any canonical document, said a word about why Magnus broke. The silence is not absence. The silence is testimony.
The Edict of Obliteration article phrases it again. Still known only to the surviving Primarchs and the God Emperor himself. The Emperor is one of the two parties named. Magnus is one of the surviving Primarchs. The two of them, across 10,000 years, have held a secret together that neither has spoken. The silence is the seal on the original instruction. The instruction was given. The instruction was carried out. The instruction was forgotten by the carrier. The Emperor, who had ordered the forgetting, watched the man who had forgotten it slowly come apart, and did nothing to stop it because to stop it would have been to admit the order had been given. Mortarian accused Magnus of sorcery at Nicaea. Magnus argued for further research. The Emperor ruled. The official frame is that Magnus then defied the ruling and brought catastrophe on himself. The frame is, on the documentary surface, correct.
What the brief asks the audience to hold simultaneously is that the man Mortarian was accusing, the man the Emperor was ruling against, the man who would defy the ruling and break the webway 4 years later, was a man whose mind already had a piece of itself missing. He defended his sorcery because his sorcery was the only thing he could still touch that was wholly his own. The part of him that had been ordered to do a thing and ordered to forget doing it had been removed from his own access.
The thing he was defending at Nicaea was the only part of himself that was left intact. Of course he defended it. He had nothing else. Remember the chronicle from the opening. The pages exist. They are blank. Magnus burned them in a single afternoon in 965 M30 and could not afterwards remember why.
The brief, taking the longer view, says he burned them because the order was the act of erasure, was a clean process, and an unburned blank stretch of pages would have asked too direct a question in his own handwriting. The afternoon of the burn is canonically unattested. It is a narrative scaffold the channel proposes. What is canonical is the absence those pages would have covered, and the documented fact that Magnus's own chronicle of his sorcery and his life is, in the form the Lexicanum and the fandom describe, complete on either side of the absence and silent inside it. The artifact behaves like an artifact that has been edited. The mind behind the artifact behaves like a mind that has been edited. The hypothesis is that the editing was done by the artifact and the mind in coordination, on order, and forgotten. What does this make Magnus? The channel's prior video framed him as the knowing executioner of Subject 11. The brief revises that. He killed his brother on order.
He was made to forget the killing. He spent the next 10,000 years not understanding the wound at the base of his own mind. The wound destabilized. The destabilization made him vulnerable to the warp voice in 004.M31. The vulnerability cost the Imperium the webway. The cost of the webway has, for the 10,000 years since, been the Emperor on the Golden Throne, the Astronomicon burning the souls of psychers to keep humanity's ships moving, the slow, grinding war against a chaos that would not have had its foothold inside Terra if the bargain had not been accepted. The chain begins with the order Magnus received in the channel's window and ends with everything that has happened in the galaxy since. Magnus did not understand any of it. He could not. The piece of himself that would have understood it had been removed. Read that as a tragedy, and you have the channel's revised Magnus.
A man who served his father's order, lost his own self to the service, and was then punished by the same father for not having survived intact what the service had taken out of him. He is, in this reading, the worst treated Primarch in the canon. Khyrosos was made for cruelty and grew into it. Lorgar was misled by Erebus and found a god to replace the one his father refused to be. Horus was raised highest and fell hardest, but Horus knew at every moment what he was choosing. Magnus did not know. The brief argues that of all 20 Primarchs, including the lost ones, Magnus is the only son whose tragedy includes the inability to perceive what was done to him. The others were broken by what they remembered. Magnus was broken by what he could not. Hold that against the canonical text of the Edict of Obliteration. Still known only to the surviving Primarchs and the God Emperor himself.
The line is a piece of internal imperial doctrine, written by an imperial archivist for an imperial reader. The line names the keepers of the secret. The keepers are the surviving Primarchs, including Magnus and the Emperor. The line does not specify that the keepers all keep the secret in the same way. One of them, in the brief's reading, keeps it by remembering. Another of them keeps it by having had the remembering excised. The secret is kept in two different shapes inside two different minds. The Emperor's mind contains the order. Magnus's mind contains the wound the order made. Both, by imperial archival standards, qualify as keepers. Only one of them is conscious of what is being kept. What this implies about the Emperor is the closing piece. The Emperor commanded a son to execute another son. The Emperor commanded that the executing son forget the act.
The emperor watched the executing sun destabilize across the following 40 years and did nothing.
The emperor watched the destabilization make the sun vulnerable to the warp bargain that broke the webway,
and did nothing in the moments before. The emperor, after the breach, sat down on the golden throne and was confined there for the rest of his recorded existence, holding the breach closed with his own life. The breach he was holding closed was the consequence of an order he had given. He sealed his own life inside the bill for his own decision. The silence with which he has held that fact for 10,000 years is, in the brief's framing, the silence of a father who knew the sun was already broken at the foundation, who watched the foundation give way, and who saw, before any other entity in the galaxy did, that what was breaking out of the webway was the long-deferred cost of an instruction he had issued in a closed room in the middle decades of the Crusade.
The imperial truth, the canonical doctrine the emperor promulgated to govern human belief, prohibits the worship of gods, the practice of sorcery, the acknowledgement of demons. The imperial truth is silent on the emperor's own decisions. The imperial truth has nothing to say about classified directives to individual primarchs, nothing to say about the edict of obliteration, nothing to say about the surviving primarchs and the god emperor himself as joint keepers of erased crimes. The imperial truth is, in this respect, a doctrine designed to keep the audience of itself looking at the wrong thing. Look at Magnus, the truth says. Look at his pride. Look at his sorcery. Look at his disobedience at Nicaea. Look at the webway breach as the consequence of his hubris. Do not look at the order he received 40 years earlier. Do not look at the chronicle pages he burned in 965.m30. Do not look at the absence in his vision of the heresy where his own role should have been. Do not look at the second party mained in the Edict of Obliteration as joint keeper of the lost Primarch's fate. The brief's reading is that the imperial truth has been pointing the audience at Magnus for 10,000 years to keep the audience from looking at his father. The wolves were sent to Prospero because the audience needed a story about a sorcerer's punishment. The story is true. The story is also a partial story, told to fill the space where the larger story, the order, the killing, the erasure, the decades of decay, the breach as cost, would otherwise have demanded to be told. The imperial truth has been a lie of emphasis. Magnus has been the surface the audience could see while the real crime sat underneath unobserved. Ask yourself one more thing before the close. The Edict of Obliteration is not a piece of Magnus's biography. It is an imperial administrative document of staggering reach. It erased 2 legions, 2 primarchs, an unknown number of campaigns, a network of worlds those campaigns affected, every Astartes record those legions kept, every commendation and reprimand and casualty list. The edict required a coordinated act of bureaucratic erasure across the entire Imperium's archive system. It required a Primarch's psychic capacity to ensure no surviving Astartes who had ever fought alongside an 11th Legion brother could ever access the memory of having done so. The line in the Edict of Obliteration article, the most successful edict of obliteration ever carried out in imperial history, is praising the operational achievement of the erasure. The achievement required an instrument. The instrument is the canonical mind-cleansing procedure refined to a scale the Imperium had no other Primarch psychically capable of executing. The instrument was, by structural necessity, Magnus. He cleansed his own mind first, because he was the only person whose mind could host the operation. He cleansed everyone else's afterwards, because once his own had been done, his foundation was already compromised, and the larger operation no longer had to leave anything intact to protect.
The Edict of Obliteration is, in the brief's reading, the largest-scale operation of warp-mediated memory editing in the recorded history of humanity, and the man who executed it is the man whose own foundation it cost. The bill for the edict has been paid in the soul of the Primarch who carried it out, every day of the 10,000 years since. That is the closing argument. The chronicle pages are blank because Magnus burned them. Magnus burned them because the order to which he was responding required no trace. The order required the act and the erasure. The act and the erasure cost his foundation. The cost of his foundation, decades later, was the webway.
The cost of the webway has been the Emperor confined, and the Imperium grinding through 10 millennia of slow defeat. The brief is asking the audience to read all of that as one chain, and to read every link as the consequence of a single instruction given in the closed room of the brief's window, by the Father to the Son, with no other party present and no record kept. Magnus the Red has stood in the warp's open eye for 10,000 years, brilliant and ruined, and has never once been able to explain to himself why the foundation of his own mind feels wrong. The imperial truth says he is a heretic because he was prideful, because he opened forbidden archives, because he reached too far. The imperial truth does not say that the wound he was reaching to anesthetize was already there when he started his sorcery. He killed a brother. He was told to. He was told to forget. He forgot. The forgetting is what broke.
Everything he has done since, the heresy, the breach, the despair, has been the slow consequence of one carefully edited afternoon in 965.m30. The Emperor commanded the editing. The Emperor watched the consequence. The Emperor never spoke of it. He still hasn't.